The termination letter sat on Claire Bennett's desk like a verdict she'd seen coming for months. Richard Keller, CEO of Keller Industries, stood across from her with arms folded, jaw tight, waiting for tears or protests or the collapse he'd witnessed from others in this same chair. But Claire just looked at the paper, then back at him, and smiled. Not with bitterness, not with defeat, but with something that looked disturbingly close to relief. Richard's expression flickered. For the first time in his career, he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. Claire had worked at Keller Industries for 3 years, quietly managing logistics coordination in a basement-level office that smelled like old carpet and instant coffee. She was never late, never loud, never the kind of person who drew attention. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Maya, a 2-bedroom apartment with a radiator that clanked at night, and a life built entirely around making ends meet without asking for help. When Richard Keller called her upstairs that Tuesday morning, she knew what was coming. The company had been downsizing for weeks, whole departments vanished overnight, desks cleared by security before anyone could say goodbye. Richard didn't waste time with small talk. He told her the position was being eliminated, that her severance would be processed within 2 weeks, and that HR would be in touch. His tone was efficient, his gaze somewhere just past her shoulder. Claire listened without interrupting. She folded her hands in her lap and nodded once when he finished. Then she smiled. It wasn't forced or sarcastic, it was genuine, almost peaceful, and it completely disarmed him. "You're taking this well?" Richard said, his voice suddenly uncertain. Claire stood, smoothing the front of her cardigan. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Keller. Truly, I hope the company does well." She extended her hand, and after a beat of visible confusion, he shook it. Her grip was firm, her eyes steady. As she walked out, Richard stood frozen in his office, staring at the door she'd closed behind her. Something about that smile unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Claire took the service elevator down, collected her few belongings, a coffee mug with Maya's handprint, a framed photo, a succulent that had somehow survived 3 years without sunlight, and left the building. Outside, the spring air was crisp and bright. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, breathing it in, and felt the knot in her chest loosen for the first time in months. She'd been afraid for so long, afraid of losing the job, afraid of not being enough, afraid of failing Maya. Now that the thing she'd feared had actually happened, there was a strange kind of freedom in it. She picked Maya up from school that afternoon, and they walked to the park near their building. Maya talked nonstop about a book her teacher had read, about a girl who painted the sky different colors every night. Claire listened, really listened, without the weight of tomorrow's deadlines pressing on her shoulders. That evening, after Maya fell asleep, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. She started writing. Not a resume, not a cover letter, but a list of things she'd always wanted to try. Small things, big things, things that scared her. The severance check arrived 2 weeks later, smaller than she'd hoped, but enough to cover rent and groceries for a couple of months if she was careful. Claire didn't panic. She took a weekend job at a bookstore near the university, where the owner let her bring Maya on Saturdays. She started a small side project, helping local nonprofits organize their donor databases, something she'd done informally for a friend's charity years ago. Word spread quietly. 1 client became 2, then 5. Within a month, she had more requests than she could handle alone. Richard Keller, meanwhile, couldn't shake the memory of that smile. It haunted him in meetings, in the car, in the mirror. He'd fired dozens of people over the years. Some cried, some argued, some left in silence. But Claire's reaction had been something else entirely. It wasn't resignation. It was release. He found himself wondering, late at night in his empty penthouse, what kind of life someone had to live to smile when they lost their livelihood, and what kind of person he'd become that he couldn't understand it. 3 months after the firing, Richard's assistant mentioned in passing that a small consulting firm called Bennett Solutions had been contracted to help with the community outreach initiative the company was launching. The name caught his attention, though he couldn't say why. When he asked to see the proposal, he froze. The signature at the bottom was hers, Claire Bennett, founder. Her photo was in the corner of the brochure, professional, confident, and wearing that same calm smile. Richard stared at it for a long time,
his coffee going cold in his hand. Claire had no idea Richard Keller knew her name beyond a personnel file. She arrived at Keller Industries the following Monday for an intake meeting, dressed in a navy blazer she'd found at a thrift store and altered herself. The conference room was full of middle managers, all of them talking over each other about metrics and optics. Claire listened, took notes, and when there was finally a pause, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. She asked 3 questions that cut straight to the heart of what they were trying to accomplish, and the room went still. By the end of the meeting, 2 people had asked for her card. Richard watched the whole thing from the back of the room. He hadn't planned to attend. He'd told himself he was just curious, but now he couldn't look away. This wasn't the woman he'd fired. Or maybe it was, and he'd never really seen her before. When the meeting ended, Claire packed her things and headed for the door. Richard stepped into the hallway just as she reached the elevator. "Miss Bennett?" She turned, and for a split second he saw a flash of recognition. Then that smile again. "Mr. Keller, good to see you." He didn't know what to say. He'd rehearsed something vague and professional in his head, but standing in front of her now, it felt hollow. "Your proposal was impressive." "Thank you. I'm glad it resonated." The elevator dinged. Claire stepped inside, and just before the doors closed, she added, "I hope the company does well." It was the exact same thing she had said the day he fired her, and this time Richard understood. It wasn't a platitude. It was a choice to move forward without bitterness. The door slid shut, and he stood alone in the hallway, feeling something uncomfortably close to shame. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the firing, the meeting, the smile. He'd built his career on decisiveness, on making the hard calls without looking back. But this time, looking back was all he could do, and he didn't like what he saw.
The Community Outreach Initiative became the most successful program Keller Industries had launched in years. Claire's strategy was simple: listen first, then act. She organized town halls, partnered with local schools, created mentorship networks that connected employees with underserved youth. The press loved it. The board loved it too. And Richard found himself in meeting after meeting, hearing Claire's name, her ideas, her impact. He requested a progress report directly from her, and she delivered it in person 2 weeks later. They met in his office on a Thursday afternoon. Claire brought a folder of data, testimonials from program participants, and a timeline for Phase 2. She was professional, articulate, and completely unbothered by the fact that this man had once ended her employment with barely a second thought. Richard, on the other hand, was deeply bothered. He asked her questions he already knew the answers to, just to keep her talking. At one point, she mentioned Maya, how her daughter had started volunteering at one of the mentorship events, reading to younger kids. Richard felt a pang of something he couldn't name. "You've built something remarkable," he said when she finished. Claire tilted her head slightly, considering him. "I didn't build it alone. People want to help each other. They just need the structure to do it." She paused, then added, "That's something I learned after I left here. When you lose the structure you thought defined you, you realize you can build your own." Richard heard the subtext. It wasn't an accusation, but it landed like one. Over the next month, their interactions became more frequent. Richard started attending the outreach events, something he never did for company programs. He told himself it was good optics, but the truth was messier. He wanted to see Claire in her element, working with people who had nothing to gain from impressing a CEO. He watched her crouch down to talk to a kid who was too shy to speak, watched her organize a donation drive with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of a neighbor. She was extraordinary, and he'd never noticed. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser at a community center, Richard found Claire in the parking lot, loading boxes of leftover supplies into her car. He offered to help, and she accepted without hesitation. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound a rhythmic thud of cardboard against metal. When the last box was in, Claire closed the trunk and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. "Long day," Richard said. She smiled, softer this time, a little tired. "Good day, though."
He wanted to ask her something real, something that mattered, but the words stuck in his throat, weighed down by months of silence and a guilt he didn't know how to name. Instead, he said, "I owe you an apology." Claire looked at him, genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For firing you the way I did. For not seeing what you were capable of." She was quiet for a moment, and he braced himself for anger, for dismissal. But when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "You didn't fire me, Mr. Keller. You freed me. I just didn't know it yet." Richard felt something crack open inside him. "I don't know how you can say that." "Because it's true. I spent 3 years in that building, afraid to take up space, afraid to ask for what I was worth. Losing that job forced me to bet on myself, and it turns out I was a safer bet than I thought." She met his eyes, and there was no malice there, only honesty. "You did me a favor. I just wish it hadn't taken something that hard to wake me up." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and they stood there in the parking lot as the streetlights flickered on. Two people who'd once been strangers, and were now something else, something undefined and unexpectedly fragile. Claire checked her watch. "I need to get home to Maya. But thank you for helping." She started toward the driver's side, then paused. "And, Mr. Keller, you don't owe me anything. But if you really want to make things right, start with the people still in that building who feel the way I used to feel." Richard watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the dusk. He stood there long after she was gone, thinking about the people still in that building, people he'd never really seen, just like he'd never really seen Claire. That night, he pulled up the employee database and started reading through files, not for performance metrics or cost-cutting, but for the names, the stories, the lives he'd reduced to line items. It was uncomfortable. It was overdue. The following week, Richard announced a company-wide review of workplace culture. He hired an outside consultant, set up anonymous feedback channels, and committed to transparency in decision-making. The staff was skeptical at first. They'd heard promises before, but Richard showed up. He attended listening sessions, took notes, and made changes. Slowly, the skepticism shifted to cautious hope. And through it all, Claire's words echoed in his mind. "Start with the people who feel the way I used to feel." Claire, for her part, was too busy to notice the shifts happening inside Keller Industries. Bennett Solutions had grown beyond her wildest projections. She hired 2 part-time assistants, both single parents like her, and started offering sliding-scale rates for nonprofits that couldn't afford market pricing. She worked late most nights, but she never missed Maya's bedtime. They had a ritual now, hot chocolate and a chapter from whatever book Maya was reading. Those 20 minutes were sacred. One night, Maya looked up from her book and asked, "Mom, do you like your job?" Claire set down her mug, surprised by the question. "I do. Why?" "You smile more now. You used to look tired all the time." Claire felt her throat tighten. She pulled Maya into a hug, breathing in the scent of her daughter's shampoo. "I am tired sometimes, sweetheart, but it's a different kind of tired. It's the kind that feels like I'm building something." Maya nodded seriously. "Like a castle?" Claire laughed. "Yeah, exactly like a castle." But the castle was about to get complicated, because the next morning, Richard Keller called Claire directly and asked her if she'd be willing to consult on something bigger, a complete restructure of Keller Industries' community engagement and employee wellness programs. It was a 6-month contract, potentially longer, with a budget that made Claire's hands shake when she saw the proposal. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the number, and felt the old fear creep back in. This was too big. What if I failed? What if I wasn't ready? But then she thought about Maya's question. "Do you like your job?" And she thought about the smile she'd given Richard Keller the day he fired her, the smile that came from realizing she was finally, terrifyingly, free to try. She picked up the phone and called him back. "I'm in. But I have conditions." Richard, to his credit, didn't hesitate. "Name them." And for the first time in her professional life, Claire Bennett did just that. The contract officially began on a Monday in late autumn, and Claire arrived at Keller Industries with a team of 3, her 2 assistants, Jenna and Marcus, and a data analyst she'd brought on for the project. Richard had cleared an entire floor for them, complete with desks, whiteboards, and a coffee machine that actually worked. Claire stood in the middle of the space, taking it all in, and felt a strange sense of déjà vu. 3 years ago, she'd worked in a basement. Now she was on the 10th floor, calling the shots. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. Richard stopped by that first morning, ostensibly to welcome the team, but really to see Claire. She was at the whiteboard, mapping out a timeline with color-coded markers, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked focused, confident, completely in her element. When she noticed him, she waved him over. "We're planning site visits to all regional offices. I want to hear directly from employees before we design anything." Richard nodded, impressed by himself. "That's a smart approach." "It's the only approach," she said simply. "You can't solve a problem you don't understand." The site visits began the following week. Claire and her team traveled to offices in 3 states, conducting focus groups and one-on-one interviews. What they found was sobering. Employees felt undervalued, disconnected from leadership, and uncertain about the company's direction. Some had been there for decades and couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked their opinion. Claire listened to every story, took detailed notes, and thanked each person for their honesty. By the time she returned to headquarters, she had a folder 2 inches thick and a clear picture of what needed to change. She presented her findings to Richard and the executive board in early December. The room was tense. These were not comfortable truths, and Claire didn't soften them. She talked about systemic issues, about the disconnect between leadership decisions and employee reality, about the erosion of trust over years of cost-cutting and layoffs. Some of the executives bristled. One VP interrupted to argue that the company had made necessary sacrifices to stay competitive. Claire didn't flinch. Sacrifices are necessary sometimes, but when the people doing the sacrificing don't feel seen or valued, you lose more than productivity. You lose loyalty, and that's much harder to rebuild. Richard, sitting at the head of the table, felt every word like a stone, because he knew she was right. He'd made those decisions, the layoffs, the budget cuts, the restructures, and he justified them with spreadsheets and projections. He'd never once thought about the person in the basement office, the single mom holding it together on a thread, the employee who smiled when she was fired because she'd already lost faith in the place long before the paperwork was signed. He looked at Claire now, standing at the front of the room with her data and her unflinching honesty, and realized she was giving him a gift, a chance to do better. The board approved her recommendations, though not without pushback. Over the next 2 months, Claire and her team implemented a series of changes: quarterly town halls where employees could ask leadership direct questions, a mentorship program that paired senior staff with newer hires, a transparency initiative that shared company performance metrics with everyone, not just executives. The changes were small on paper, but they shifted the culture in ways that couldn't be quantified. People started speaking up. Ideas started flowing. The building felt different. Richard watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and discomfort. Pride because the company was genuinely improving. Discomfort because Claire's presence forced him to confront the leader he'd been, detached, transactional, more concerned with the bottom line than the people generating it. He started showing up differently. He walked the floors, learned names, asked questions, and actually listened to the answers. It was exhausting and humbling, and it felt like the most important work he'd ever done. Claire noticed the change in him, though she didn't comment on it. They fell into a rhythm. Weekly check-ins that often stretched longer than scheduled, conversations that drifted from metrics to philosophy, to the small human details that made work meaningful. Richard learned that Claire loved old jazz records, that she'd taught herself to code in college, that Maya wanted to be a marine biologist. Claire learned that Richard had built the company with his late father, that he'd been trying to live up to a legacy that never quite felt his, that he was lonelier than anyone suspected. One evening in late January, they were the last ones in the office. Claire was at her desk, finalizing a report, and Richard was in his office across the hall staring at a contract he couldn't focus on. He got up, walked over, and knocked lightly on her open door. "You should go home." Claire glanced at the clock and sighed. "I know, just one more section." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up, curious. "Sure." "Why did you smile that day, when I fired you?" Claire set down her pen, considering the question. "Honestly,
because I realized I'd been waiting for permission to leave, and you'd just given it to me. I was so afraid of failing, of not providing for Maya, that I stayed in a place that made me small. When you fired me, I didn't have to be afraid anymore. The worst thing had already happened, and I was still standing. Richard felt his chest tighten. I'm sorry I made you feel small. Claire shook her head gently. You didn't make me feel that way, Mr. Keller. I did that to myself. You just happened to be there when I finally stopped.
He wanted to say more, to tell her that she'd changed everything, the company, his perspective, maybe even him. But the words felt too big, too raw. So instead, he said, "Call me Richard." She smiled, and this time it was warm, almost playful. "Okay, Richard." It felt like a door opening. He cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Go home to Maya. The report can wait." Claire laughed softly. "You're right. Good night, Richard." "Good night, Claire." He watched her gather her things and leave, and when the elevator doors closed behind her, he stood alone in the quiet office and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. The regret, the admiration, the growing awareness that what he felt for Claire Bennett had shifted into something he wasn't ready to name. He went back to his office, poured himself a drink he didn't want, and stared out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Claire was reading to her daughter, building a life that didn't need him, and he couldn't stop thinking about what it would be like if it did. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He scheduled a meeting with HR and asked them to review every termination from the past 5 years. He wanted to know how many people like Claire had been let go without a second thought, how many had been undervalued or overlooked. The HR director looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but Richard didn't care. He needed to see the full picture. And if there were others who deserved a second chance, he was going to find them. Claire, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own complicated feelings. She respected Richard, admired him even, but she also remembered the man who'd fired her without hesitation, who'd built a company culture that prioritized profit over people. The changes he was making were real, but were they permanent? Or would he revert to old patterns the moment she walked away? She didn't have answers, only questions, and a growing sense that the boundaries she'd carefully maintained were starting to blur. One Saturday, Richard ran into Claire and Maya at a farmer's market near the river. It was pure coincidence. He was there picking up coffee beans, and they were at a flower stand, Maya holding a bundle of sunflowers almost as tall as she was. Richard hesitated, unsure if he should approach, but Maya spotted him first. "Mom, that's the man from your work." Claire turned, surprised, and for a moment their eyes met across the crowded market. Then she smiled and waved him over. Richard walked up, suddenly awkward in jeans and a sweater instead of a suit. "Hi, didn't expect to see you here. We come every weekend," Claire said. "Maya, this is Mr. Keller. He's a colleague." "You can call me Richard," he said, crouching down to Maya's level. "Those are beautiful sunflowers." Maya beamed. "They're for our kitchen table. Mom says they make the room happy." Richard glanced at Claire, who looked faintly embarrassed. "She's not wrong." They walked together for a while, Maya chattering about the different stalls, Claire relaxed in a way Richard had never seen at the office. He bought them cider and a bag of fresh bread, and they sat on a bench by the river, watching boats drift past. It felt easy, natural, like something that had been waiting to happen. When it was time to go, Maya hugged Richard's leg without warning, then ran ahead to the car. Claire laughed, shaking her head. "Sorry, she's affectionate." "Don't apologize. She's wonderful. You both are." Claire looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "Thanks for the cider, Richard. Anytime." As she walked away, Richard stayed on the bench, watching the river and feeling the unmistakable pull of something he hadn't allowed himself in years: hope. And for the first time since that day in his office, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, the worst thing that had happened might turn into the best.
By early spring, the transformation at Keller Industries was undeniable. Employee retention was up, satisfaction scores doubled, and the company had been featured in a national business magazine as a model for ethical restructuring. Claire's contract was nearly complete, and the board had already begun discussing ways to extend it or bring her on in a permanent advisory capacity. But Claire wasn't sure what she wanted. Bennett Solutions was thriving independently, and part of her worried that staying too close to Keller Industries, staying too close to Richard, would complicate things in ways she wasn't prepared for. Richard, meanwhile, was running out of time. The contract ended in 6 weeks, and the thought of Claire walking out of the building for good made him feel something uncomfortably close to panic. He'd spent months trying to be professional, to keep his feelings buried under layers of respect and distance, but the truth was getting harder to ignore. He cared about her, deeply, and he had no idea if she felt even a fraction of the same. The turning point came on a Tuesday in April, at the company's annual gala, a black-tie event that Claire had helped redesign to include employees at every level, not just executives and donors. The ballroom was filled with people from the warehouse, the regional offices, the support staff who usually worked in the background. Claire stood near the entrance, in a simple navy dress, watching the room with quiet satisfaction. This was what she'd hoped for, a night where everyone felt seen. Richard spotted her from across the room and felt his breath catch. She looked radiant, not because of the dress or the setting, but because she was glowing with the kind of pride that comes from work that matters. He made his way over, and when she saw him, her face lit up. "You did this," he said, gesturing to the crowded room. "We did this," she corrected. "You let it happen." He wanted to tell her that he'd let a lot of things happen because of her, that she'd changed him in ways he was still discovering. But before he could find the words, the program began. Richard gave the opening speech, and for the first time in years, he spoke from the heart instead of a script. He talked about the importance of people over profit, about listening instead of assuming, about the courage it takes to admit you've been wrong and the grace required to rebuild trust. He didn't mention Claire by name, but everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. When he finished, the applause was genuine and long, and Claire felt tears prick her eyes. Later in the evening, they found themselves on the balcony, away from the noise. The city stretched out below them, lit up like a constellation. Claire leaned on the railing, breathing in the cool night air. Richard stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "That was a good speech," she said. "I meant every word." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "I know you did." Richard turned to face her fully, his heart pounding. "Claire, I need to tell you something." She straightened, suddenly nervous. "Okay?" He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "When I fired you, I made a mistake. Not just professionally, personally. I didn't see you. And now that I do, I can't stop. You've changed everything. This company, the way I lead, the way I see the world. And He stopped, struggling. "I don't want you to leave when the contract ends, not because I need a consultant, because I need you." Claire's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, hadn't let herself imagine it, but now that the words were out in the open, she realized she'd been feeling the same pull. "Richard, He don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know I don't deserve a chance after everything, but I had to tell you the truth." Claire shook her head, stepping closer. "You're right. It is complicated, and you're right that you made a mistake, but so did I. I convinced myself that I didn't matter, that I had to shrink to survive. You didn't make me feel small, Richard. I did that. But you helped me remember I could be big, and that means something." He looked at her, hope and fear tangled in his chest. "What are you saying?" Claire smiled, that same smile that had haunted him for months, but this time it was softer, more vulnerable. "I'm saying I don't know what happens next, but I'd like to figure it out, with you." Richard felt something break open inside him, something that had been locked away for years. He reached for her hand, tentative, and she let him take it. Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment they just stood there, holding on in the quiet. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the balcony door opening. One of the event coordinators poked her head out, apologizing for the intrusion, but explaining that Claire was needed inside for the employee recognition segment. Claire squeezed Richard's hand once before letting go, and they walked back into the ballroom together, something unspoken but understood passing between them. The recognition segment was emotional. Employees nominated by their peers, stories of mentorship and resilience, and small acts of kindness that had ripple effects. Claire stood to the side watching and felt the weight of what they'd built together. When the evening finally wound down, Richard walked her to her car. The parking lot was nearly empty, the sounds of the city muted in the distance. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight. For everything." Claire looked up at him, her expression open. "Thank you for taking a chance. On all of this."
He wanted to kiss her. The impulse was overwhelming, but he held back, unsure if she was ready, if they were ready. Instead, he brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Good night, Claire." "Good night, Richard." She got in her car and drove away, and Richard stood in the parking lot long after her taillights disappeared, feeling like a man who'd been walking in the dark for years and had just found a light. Over the next few weeks, things shifted between them in small, significant ways. Coffee meetings turned into dinners. Work emails became text messages that had nothing to do with projects. Richard met Maya officially, showing up at a school science fair where she presented a model of the ocean floor. He asked questions and listened intently, and Maya decided on the spot that he was okay for a grown-up. Claire laughed, and Richard felt like he'd won something more valuable than any contract. But with the contract end date looming, Claire had to make a decision. The board had offered her a permanent position as Chief Culture Officer, a role that had never existed before. It was a dream opportunity, stable, impactful, well compensated. But it also meant tying herself to Keller Industries in a way that would make leaving difficult if things went wrong. And if things went wrong with Richard, leaving would be more than difficult. It would be devastating. She talked it over with Maya one night, the two of them curled up on the couch. "What if I took a really big job, but it meant things might get complicated?" Maya frowned, thinking, "Is it a good job?" "I think so. I'd be helping a lot of people." "Then you should do it. And if it gets complicated, we'll figure it out. We always do." Claire pulled her daughter close, marveling at her wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart, Mom. You just notice more now." The next day, Claire walked into Richard's office and accepted the position. He stood up, a grin breaking across his face, and before either of them could think better of it, he pulled her into a hug. It was brief, professional enough to pass if anyone walked in, but it felt like a promise. When they stepped apart, Claire looked up at him and said, "No regrets." "No regrets," he echoed. And for the first time in a long time, both of them believed it. The announcement was made the following week, and the response from staff was overwhelmingly positive. Claire had earned their trust, and they were glad she was staying. But not everyone was thrilled. A handful of senior executives who'd resisted her changes from the start saw her permanent appointment as a threat. They began pushing back on initiatives, questioning budgets, undermining her authority in subtle ways. Claire handled it with grace, but Richard saw the toll it was taking. One evening, he called an impromptu meeting with the executive team and made something very clear. Claire Bennett had his full support, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him directly. The room went silent. A few executives nodded. One resigned the following week. Richard didn't lose sleep over it. He'd spent too long trying to keep everyone comfortable at the expense of doing what was right. That era was over. Claire heard about the meeting secondhand and felt a rush of gratitude mixed with something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to love. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet, but it was there, growing quietly in the spaces between their conversations. And when Richard showed up at her apartment that weekend with takeout and offered to help Maya with her science homework, Claire realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be afraid of this. Maybe the worst thing that had ever happened to her, the firing, the fear, the forced rebuilding, had led her exactly where she needed to be.
6 months into her role as Chief Culture Officer, Claire had become an integral part of Keller Industries' identity. The company was thriving, not just financially but culturally, and the changes she'd championed were now embedded in how the organization operated. But more than that, Claire had found something she'd never expected: home. Not in the building or the title, but in the people, the purpose, and the man who'd once fired her
and now couldn't imagine a single day without her input, her insight, her presence. Richard and Claire's relationship had evolved, slowly, carefully, both of them aware of the stakes. They kept things private at first, dinners after Maya was asleep, long phone calls that stretched past midnight, weekends spent at museums or parks where they could just be two people figuring each other out. Richard was patient, never pushing, always letting Claire set the pace. And Claire, who'd spent years guarding her heart, found herself letting him in, piece by piece. One Sunday in late autumn, Richard joined Claire and Maya at a pumpkin patch outside the city. They spent the afternoon wandering through rows of orange gourds, Maya insisting on finding the perfect pumpkin, which changed definition every 5 minutes. Richard carried the rejects without complaint, and when Maya finally chose one nearly as big as she was, he hoisted it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Claire watched him, this powerful man who ran a multi-million-dollar company, covered in hay and grinning like a kid, and felt something settle deep in her chest. That evening, after they dropped Maya off with Claire's mom for a sleepover, Richard and Claire sat on her apartment balcony with mugs of cider. The city hummed below them, alive and indifferent, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Claire felt completely at peace. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. Claire nodded. "Do you ever regret it? Taking the job, getting involved with me, all of it?" She thought about it, really thought about it. "No. I used to be afraid of regret, afraid of making the wrong choice, but I've learned that the only real mistake is not choosing at all." Richard reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I don't deserve you." Claire laughed softly. "You don't get to decide that. I do. And I'm still here, aren't I?" He looked at her, his expression serious, almost reverent. "I love you, Claire. I don't know when it happened, maybe that first day when you smiled and I had no idea what I was looking at. Maybe later, when I realized you were braver than anyone I'd ever met. But it's true, and I needed you to know." Claire felt tears sting her eyes, but they were the good kind, the kind that come with relief and recognition. "I love you too. I didn't think I had room for this, for you, but somehow you fit, and I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." Richard leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, he kissed her. It was gentle and sure, a promise and a question all at once. When they finally broke apart, Claire rested her forehead against his and smiled. "Took you long enough."
Richard laughed, the sound full and genuine. "I didn't want to rush you. I know, and I love you for it." They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other and the quiet, and when the night grew too cold, they moved inside, tangled together on the couch, talking about everything and nothing until the early hours of the morning. It felt easy. It felt right. It felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting all along. The following spring, Keller Industries launched its largest community initiative yet, a nationwide program connecting corporations with underserved schools, providing mentorship, funding, and resources. Claire led the project, and Richard stood beside her at the press conference, introducing her not as an employee, but as a partner in every sense of the word. The media picked up on the story. The CEO, who'd once fired a single mom, now working alongside her to change lives. It made for a compelling narrative, but the truth was quieter and deeper than any headline could capture. Maya, now 8 and wise beyond her years, asked Claire one night if Richard was going to be around forever. Claire paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know about forever, sweetheart, but I know he's here now and he cares about us. Is that okay with you?" Maya considered this seriously, then nodded. "Yeah, he's nice. And he makes you smile the real way." Claire's heart swelled. "The real way?" "Yeah, like you're not just happy, you're safe." Claire realized then that Maya had seen everything, had understood more than she'd given her credit for, and the fact that her daughter felt safe, that she recognized the difference between surface happiness and true peace was the greatest gift Claire could have asked for. That night, after Maya fell asleep, Claire called Richard. She said, "You make me smile the real way." Richard's voice was soft over the line. "Do I?" "Yeah, you do." A year later, on a Saturday morning in June, Richard proposed. Not in a grand, public way, but quietly, in Claire's kitchen while they made pancakes and Maya hummed to herself in the next room. He got down on one knee with a simple ring and said, "I don't have a speech prepared. I just know I want to spend the rest of my life making you smile the real way, if you'll let me." Claire looked at him, this man who'd once been a stranger and a mistake, and was now the person who knew her best, and said yes without hesitation. They were married 4 months later in a small ceremony at the community center where they'd first worked together on the outreach program. The guest list was a mix of family, friends, and Keller Industries employees who'd become like family over the years. Maya was the flower girl and took her role very seriously, marching down the aisle with a basket of petals and a look of fierce concentration. When Richard and Claire exchanged vows, they spoke about second chances, about the courage it takes to rebuild, about love that doesn't erase the past but redeems it. At the reception, Richard gave a toast that brought half the room to tears. He talked about the day he fired Claire, about the smile that had haunted him, about the fact that sometimes the worst decisions lead to the best outcomes if you're willing to learn from them. "I thought I was ending something that day," he said, looking at Claire. "But really, I was just clearing the path for something better. For us." Claire stood, walked over and kissed him in front of everyone, and the room erupted in applause. Years later, when people asked how they'd met, Claire always smiled and said, "He fired me." And when they looked confused, Richard would add, "Best mistake I ever made." Because it was true. The firing had been a catalyst, a necessary breaking point that forced both of them to become who they were meant to be. And in the end, it wasn't about the job or the title or the company. It was about two people who'd learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. And what really mattered was standing right in front of them, smiling the real way, ready to build a life that neither of them could have imagined, but both of them had always deserved.